Welcome to Modern Mythology, a podcast that explores the many intersections of story and system. In every episode, we will discuss some facet of how RPGs function as modern myths, providing a shared canvas for creativity and the collaborative discovery of new worlds. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net. Episode 1, Why Modern Mythology?
Why modern mythology? How did this come about? What were you thinking of?
Right.
Where was your brain space when you think about all of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, modern mythology was originally already based around the idea of like how the media space, if you want to call it that, movies, comics, whatever, inform our ideas about ourselves and each other, and that kind of community, sort of communal. It's because a myth has that element of a communal, relational idea, where it's like, I know what Loki is, you know what Loki is, or at least you have this sort of place in your head, and you relate over that. And it took a long time for me to realize, though, that that's kind of the same thing we're doing around the gaming table, and also kind of how fundamental it is to my own creative process. I mean, I started as a writer, quote unquote, really as a DM. And it kind of, my writing kind of grew out of that. Not originally in terms of like, I'm going to write the campaign that we did, but like the same sort of processes of character building and how I'm building a world and developing characters is the same, and so it makes a lot of sense, at least to me, to kind of bring those ideas together finally and go with it that way.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Did I start writing first or did I start gaming first?
Right.
I think they were probably pretty simultaneous. I'm with you, those, processes. And really that's what we're talking about through most of this podcast is processes, right? We're talking about procedure. We're talking about ritual. There are these old ways to frame the idea when somebody says myth or mythology, right? You think of antiquity, right? And there are some people who are very old in the ways that they think about gaming, right? Mm-hmm. You and I were talking about, I see new podcasts that are still talking about these ideas, and like why this podcast I think is relevant to us is because there's a lot of people who still don't approach their games in ways other than the old formula, right? Which
by the old formula, you mean kind of gamist, or
yes and no. Mm. That's a good question. I think more in terms of story. I think most people, when they think role-playing, regardless of whether or not they're delivering story, they think they're delivering a story. Yeah. I'm not trying to be like disparaging. I'm not trying to like say like people don't know what they're doing, or like the old conversation was like, are you trying to tell me how to have fun, right? Like everybody wants what they want out of their gaming table, right? Yeah. But there are myths within the gaming community, right? There are these things that we're hanging our hat on, and this idea that we know how to play or run a game, right? There's a lot of GM advice that's scattered throughout RPG books. And it's a lot of times it's the exact same stuff. There's a lot of GMs who don't need to read that stuff because they're like, okay, I'm playing the NPCs, I'm playing the world, I'm describing it to the characters, I'm developing the situations. Now the players are just sitting there. They're just like these little potatoes, and they're just sitting there
until it's their turn to roll a die.
It's right. Until it's their turn to roll the die or do something or whatever the case is, right? And I'm not saying that those kinds of games don't players don't have responsibilities. They do. A player can really kind of slow things down if they're not on top of at least what they're doing or paying attention.
Sure.
And I used to be a real stickler about that sort of stuff, right? Well, what were you doing around the table? I had friends of mine who used to knit. It drove me batty.
Well, that actually helps some. I mean, you probably realize this now, but it actually helps some people focus.
Right. But but again, I was old in the way I thought about this whole process, and particularly from my teaching days. Like, why are you not paying attention to me, right? And I know better now, especially in the sea of neurodivergence that we
Like as a kid, I always my way of focusing the most was to sketch, and I always got in trouble for it. Why are you drawing? And it's like, well, if I'm not drawing, I can't pay attention.
Right. Right. So yeah, I'm with you. It is part of the development process and this just shared experience, and it is interesting to think about the old school ways of thinking about mythology and how that ties to medieval and fantasy, right? Which is the source of most of us. We have a very rare number of people who have not approached this through a fantasy lens.
Yeah,
they're there.
Yeah.
They're there, but it was old heads like me either came in through D&D, came in through Traveler, came in through White Wolf, right? And so it's the latter that are definitely in this idea of, which is interesting, right? Definitely in this idea of like, I'm telling story, but how much of your system is telling story?
Right. That's a whole topic we'll get into. But this is also really interesting to me because the idea of like running a modern campaign versus running a fantasy campaign. For me, and this gets into Fallen Cycle, what I'm trying to do with the Fallen Cycle, it's driven by archetypes. And really, like, there are things that are kind of make something fantasy versus sci-fi or whatever. But you can use the same archetypes for both. And I know this because I've done it and I've seen it work. And what's interesting is it's usually more like the environmental factors that change the kind of stories you can do. Like, for instance, we have a cyberpunk campaign where you have characters who can know what's happening across the world in an instant because they have a cell phone. The cell phone changes the setting and like the context of the world. It can be more than, like I have another campaign that's, kind of more like 14th century sort of setting where it's like a lot of the things are the same except that, they're in the woods, right? They're in the woods and they can't know unless they have some sort of magical way of whatever. But like, it's just a lot. Those are the things that tend to distinguish it, I think, a lot more than what the archetypes are for the characters or even like under the story.
100%. Well, and that gets into when I approach campaigns. You look at things like the basic structures of like, there's only so many plots, right? Granted, everybody has their own version.
Right. There's a million variations.
There's a million variations of but there's only a finite number of plots. Whether that be 36 or 20 or 8, but using those ideas, same thing with story structure. It's funny. We're brought up with this idea of a 3-act play, right? But Japanese storytelling is actually very different.
I was just going to point that out.
Yeah, and how you approach that.
That's how I wrote Tales. I used more of that structure.
The Japanese structure. And then consequently now the advent of the script has changed that also. Like there's a lot of really good story structures out there that are much more attuned to, say, television scripts. And now you're looking at not only this idea of a 3-act play, but you're also looking at how does that affect the greater seasonal tone? And how do you fit that into 110 pages? Where you can actually really be much more prescriptive, much more structured with these very broad ideas, right? And again, hitting on that tone of commonality. What is this shared experience, right? When you had oral traditions, there was a way they started. There was something that signified that we were all sitting around the fire, right? Or that there was this tale, like the idea of once upon a time,
Sure.
right, is based on that or those oral traditions, right? So we're really bringing those ideas together, right? We're using this old antiquated idea of mythology and ritual and oral tradition, but then we're using new mediums, which...
And at the same time, I completely agree with that, but it also kind of frame it as terms of like, they aren't antiquated. They're the things we already do now. We just don't realize it.
Sure.
But I don't disagree with you. Like it is still, kind of the ancient forms. It's just that, know.
But that's when you think, I'm saying the words, when you think mythology.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You think Norse, you think Greek, kind of idea. You think, naked boys on the sides of vases, Yeah.
I mean, this is a way, it's like I've been so close to the idea of myth. I mean, when I was in high school, it started with Joseph Campbell, but that's just where it started. So like the way I think about myth is probably not the common, kind of perception of it. Just like, Mythbusters, people think of myth in that way of it being a false story. And
right.
It's more of a story that could be true or false.
Right.
That's not, it's kind of like more like its truthness or falsity is just kind of irrelevant to its being a myth. Not that it's...
But yet profoundly relevant. I think that's a big part of what we're talking about, right? Is that these stories have to be relevant.
Oh yeah, the stories themselves have to be. I mean,
and so that, but
truthiness.
That's right. No, absolutely, and that's what I'm saying. That juxtaposition, right, of the irrelevance of the truth, but the relevance of the experience, right, and bringing it in. It's why you have some of these deities, like say the Egyptian deities, right? The Egyptian pantheon is a lot less relatable, right, than say the Greeks. They weren't seen as fallible, right? You have, it's why you think about stuff like why I think that, not again, I'm not trying to offend anybody, but why the Christ myth becomes so important is because you're making this God more relatable, right? And again, like you're saying, the truth of these ideas,
and Osiris, and Dionysus, but anyways,
right. And the Roman one, I forget his name. Right, and it, like you said, the truth of these ideas, right, are irrelevant. Which I think is kind of what Gaiman's getting to in American Gods. Right, is this stuff changes. And these ideas and what's important changes, and can we adapt with them? And that's what we're looking for.
And also giving the structure, I think, underneath it is a big part. Because, talking about archetypes and also story structure, that's kind of like, it's funny to me that there isn't more of this in more RPG books, where there isn't more I although I rail against the idea that you have to follow the Campbell hero cycle for every story, this is the way to do it. When you have that sort of pattern underneath, quote unquote RPG, it creates much more of a sense of kind of what you're doing around the table. And, so I think that's part of what I've been trying to do too, is also bring that into play, because it's kind of already implicitly at play around in a lot of tables, but I don't think people necessarily are doing it explicitly,
No, and our ideas of role playing have very much changed with the various types of media. On one hand, you see a lot of people who are bucking against the idea of emulating video games, right? We saw that with 4th edition, where people were like, this is just too much like WoW. This is World of Warcraft. This is too much like a video game experience, right? On the other hand, you also see people who are, I don't want to be a video game. On the other hand, the idea of some of the sandbox worlds have really inspired people to create campaigns more like that, where they'll show, here is a line, but your players may not necessarily follow said line. There are a lot of GMs that I know that are just like, what do you do? Like, they don't even start with a situation. It's just, what do you do? You're in a tavern. Next, and the players are inspired to sort of drive.
I mean, if you have momentum already, or you have the right kind of group, that can work. But it is my experience usually that you want to have things that happen in the world. If what they want to do is nothing, if what they want to do is what they usually do as a character, in that situation.
I want us to have access to, this is poor planning on my part, to like the cricket sound,
right? Especially if you're playing online,
right?
If you start a game online, you're running online, like, okay, first session, first thing, everything, like, okay, guys, what do you do?
Right.
Like, it's not gonna.
And so. So that's our framework. Our framework is, what is modern mythology and how are we going to approach this, right? Our second piece is format. As you probably could tell, it's very conversational, right? It is very unscripted. And I don't know if that's on purpose or it's just laziness, but I see a lot of podcasts and a lot of YouTube channels where they've written everything out and they just sort of do it. I'm not saying that's not engaging, and I think for monologues it's great. But I don't know that's where we want to be. And
I'm definitely too ADHD for that to be a conversational format. I can definitely do that for a monologue, but
which is really kind of funny because we're both writers, right? It's really kind of funny that this is our ability to go off script. Also, like, longevity wise, I think the conversation becomes the important piece of the equation. I think it's important to not get information from one head, right? And the talking head piece. I think what we're doing is we're going to bring in multiple voices to talk about this stuff and frame this stuff to some degree to convince, right?
But also to get other perspectives. I mean, this podcast partially came out of us having a discussion that's gone on for years about how RPG systems work and how storytelling works and how these things kind of work together.
Right. So. And our discovery that there is no end to the amount of that we can talk about this. We have known each other for years. We've had hours and hours and hours of conversations about this stuff, many, many hours of playing. And, I think it was just sort of about time that we, put this down in, not a prescribed way, but in a organic way.
Yeah.
So the last piece, so we're going to have a lot of people in. We do have.
We might do actual plays, but it's not the focus of it.
Yes. So really for context.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And so the next question is, what do we want to get out of this? Like, what do we want to see? What do we want our audience to get out of this? Why are we doing this? What are our kind of goals and where are we going with this stuff?
Yeah. I mean, part of it is to kind of help, for me anyways, personally, is to help kind of collect my ideas about how these things work. Because I've been doing it naturally in a lot of ways for years, but it's kind of like, obviously if we're doing conversation, it's not exactly systematizing it, but, kind of bringing it to the fore. And also I've been in the background developing an RPG for a while, and kind of like, if I'm going to do a system, like there's so many systems out there, I kind of want to take my time with it and really think through those processes, especially in terms of it being, very focused on archetypes and myth. The Fallen Cycle is kind of based around that premise. So, just taking kind of like an idea from this RPG, an idea from that RPG, and then calling it a day didn't feel right to me, so that kind of, I guess, my personal side of it. But I also am really excited to have these conversations with people and with you and with Mark. So far, those conversations have already kind of opened up my mind about the interaction of system and story. So,
I certainly find I've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah.
I think combined between the three of us, I've worked it out. We have easily over 100 years
Something
worth
like
of role-playing experience.
Since I was like 11 and I'm 40 something.
Yeah. So I hear what you're saying. I certainly believe that I learned things by talking and teaching. I learned things by having those conversations because I'm forced to think through them, right? And having those alternative views become critical. While there's going to be a lot of stuff that we agree on, I'm hoping we are going to strike on these ideas.
Pretty often I find we disagree and yet agree at the same time, which is kind of weirdly paradoxical, but somehow it seems to come out that way.
Because it's sometimes just a different approach. It's like the same, we get to the same place just from a different path. And we're all going to be running games. We're all going to hopefully be learning from each other. And you're going to see very different styles and approaches to this stuff. And we're all over the board in terms of experiences, and yet there's a lot of overlap, right? So Mark is a military guy. He's a gun guy. He does a lot of training. He reads a lot of books about global politics and things like that.
I've been very interested in geopolitics since I started doing journalism a little while ago, but probably not as intensely. I don't know. But
you and I both have had a long love for the occult and sort of the way that you think about these things. Both of us are writers. And, so I feel like it's a good marriage, it's, our weird little gaming polycule of ideas.
Yeah. Well, they say the main reason to be poly is so that you can have a gaming group.
Right.
That to share rent, I guess.
And I want to solidify some of these ideas. I think I see a lot of the ideas behind these games are all over the place. Sometimes they're just couched as like GM advice in something, right? We're going to be mentioning a lot of YouTubers and podcasters that we love, that we talk to, that we engage with or listen to, and some of the great things that they're bringing to the table, as well as these wonderful little gems of games that people aren't really aware of, or they think, well, that's not for me. There's nothing in that game that I'm going to take to my table, right? And I'm hoping that these conversations we can have with our audience, and then consequently we can start building this idea of ways to bring story, ways to bring myth to our tables. Yeah. Right. And again, we're not trying to say, if you have a way of going, if you want to play a game in a particular prescribed way, then all power to you. But if you're in any way struggling or any way want to change that up, I'm hesitant, but I'm going to say it anyway. Elevate, like how you are approaching these games. Create some longevity. Sometimes it's burnout. Sometimes it's like tyranny of the blank page. I don't know what we want to do today.
This because so many of my campaigns have gone on for years, and when I talk to people who are always like, "Really? How do you do it?" It's like, wow, how do I do it? That's another reason why I have this podcast, to figure out how I do it.
Right? Yes. Awesome. So I think that's our goals: is communicate and codify, bring into one place these ideas of what you can do to make your games mythical, make your games great, make your games epic, and
something you remember later.
Something you remember later, you come back to.
Do you want to know what the fallen are, little one? In a sense, they are angels, but not the angels your mom imagines she prays to. Brass trumpets picnicking in the clouds. In their true essence, they are great swirling engines of wing and blood, fiery eyes that peer around the corners between worlds. Dark, radiant things conjured from fresh battlefields. A Frankenstein's Valkyrie, forever crashing to Midgard. What grief demands their hate? What vast cannibal hunger?
Welcome to the Fallen Cycle. This is a universe full of secrets, waiting for those brave or foolhardy enough to seek them out. Discover more about the myth-punk Fallen Cycle universe at fallencycle.com.
Anything else we want to talk about? That's we covered a lot of ground.
We covered the intro. I mean, there's so many topics to unpack. Player agency is one we'll get to soon.
Yep. Atmosphere. Yeah. So format of the bigger picture. We have a lot to talk about. I'm very much hoping that we have people who want to engage, because we're going to be, our format as a general rule is going to be looking at genres. Mm-hmm. So we believe that different genres should have different tools. Sometimes there's overlap, like player agency, right? But sometimes these genres bring a whole new element of storytelling to them that you can't really tell with the other ones. And you're going to be able to use some of these tools for other ones. For instance, we're going to have a military sort of series where you could have a military campaign in your fantasy game. So there's going to be some cross-sectional pieces. There's, whenever talking about stuff like trench warfare, it's a very easy place to go to mix horror and military, right? Mm-hmm. Or something like Cthulhu Punk, where you're going to mix horror and cyberpunk. So our four, as far as I see it now, is we're going to start with horror, we're going to go into military, cyberpunk, and then fantasy.
Sure. We'll see how it develops. But
see how it develops, 100%. That's just a broad strokes. And then we're going to run games. We have an actual play series. We have a number of games that both of us are running right now that we're going to bring into the fold. We're going to talk about our development processes, right? And how we're developing these games, as well as the three of us are going to continually play these games and bring some of these games to your attention, what they can add to your games, right? For each of the particular genres.
Yeah. That covers the basis. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And just really, really looking forward to, it's honestly, I was on a hiatus for gaming for RPGs, not gaming, for RPGs for a while. And it's interesting that we have this now, because I am currently in the process of selling thousands of RPG books. And so as I'm wondering if there's a piece of that's spurring this along, right? Like not only handling all of these books, but also watching them go, right?
A little bit. Although, for me, although I was already kind of, I took a hiatus too, mostly during the 2010s. But by 2016 or so, I was playing Fit 5e again and starting to play some other things. But the pandemic really was part of what kind of it made RPGs become a real central fixture in my life again. It started with playing and running online, because it was kind of everyone had the time all of a sudden to be able to really get into their characters. And with the 2054 Blackout campaign I ran, it was people were actually excited to do their homework, we're going to call it that.
And the technology,
had also started to come along.
Really, scaffolded those efforts.
Yeah. Yeah, although that's one thing we can get into also about the more like in a video game of some VTTs are very kind of becoming more and more presenting a sort of almost isomorphic video game experience sort of thing. And, is that good or bad? I guess
good or bad, right?
But, it's definitely something to talk about.
I will say that while we're going to spend most of our time around the table, we would be remiss to not explore some online conversations.
And then most of the Fallen Cycle campaigns I've been running have been online because of the players I have for it who I really want to play with. They're scattered all over the US. So if we do any actual plays with that, they'll probably be recorded from online play.
But we should probably have an episode or two about VTT.
Yeah,
we should probably get into some of that in like the idea of storytelling across that medium as well.
Some things I found do work differently or better or worse in that format.
Right.
And I've definitely encountered people who've played a lot in person and someone kind of jump into that and are surprised that it works differently and kind of like, why isn't this thing that I always do working?
Right.
So we can talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
You have been listening to another episode of the Modern Mythology Podcast. We hope we gave you something new to think about that you can bring to your RPGs, writing, and other character-based games and art forms. Produced by James Kershaw. Soundtrack by Scott Landis and James Kershaw. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net.